It was January 1945. The sky over Bodney AFB in England was as grey as molten lead. The wind bit into the skin of the mechanics working on the wings of Republic P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. The smell of aviation oil mingled with the chilly morning air. In the distance, the muffled roar of Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engines echoed between the hangars. It was another day of escort operations over occupied Germany. Another day where the mathematics of survival depended on altitude, speed, and discipline. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this video from right now? Comment below with your city or country. It's always impressive to see how far these stories reach across the globe. Now let's go back to that freezing January day, where it all began so unexpectedly. The air war over Europe was at its most intense. The United States Army Air Force conducted daily strategic bombing missions against German industrial targets. Boeing B-17 and consolidated B-24 heavy bombers crisscrossed the continent in tight formations, protected by escort fighters that engaged the Luftwaffe in fierce dogfights. The P-47 Thunderbolt was known as a robust, heavy fighter, capable of absorbing significant damage and returning to base. It weighed over 15,000 pounds fully loaded. Its 2,000-horsepower radial engine made it a reliable machine, but it was not considered the most agile of the Allied fighters. It was a workhorse. It wasn't as elegant as the Mustang. It didn't turn as quickly as the Spitfire. But it survived. Among the pilots of the 352nd Fighter Group was Lieutenant Roger Clinton Brownell, a native of Springfield, Massachusetts. Brownell was 24 years old and had logged 37 missions. Before the war, he had worked as a technician in an industrial turbine factory. He understood mechanics. He understood pressure, rotation, and the resistance of materials. His approach to aerial combat was methodical. He didn't seek glory. He sought efficiency. Each mission was a technical problem to be solved. Each return to base was confirmation that his calculations were correct. That January morning, Brownell received orders for a long-range escort mission. The target was a synthetic oil refinery near Magdeburg, in the heart of Germany. The route would take the bombers through 220 miles of hostile territory. Enemy Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters would be waiting. Anti-aircraft artillery would turn the sky into a zone of steel fragments. The mission was clear. Keep the bombers safe. Don't chase individual targets. Don't break formation. Discipline above all else. Brownell donned his flight suit, adjusted his parachute harness, and walked to his Thunderbolt. The aircraft was parked at the edge of the runway, its four-blade propeller motionless against the gray sky. The name Big Stud was painted on the nose. He climbed onto the wing, slid into the cockpit, and began his pre-flight check. Instruments, controls, radio, everything responded as it should. The engine ignited. A deep roar filled the air. The propeller began to spin, slowly at first, then accelerated until it disappeared into a translucent disc. Brownell felt the familiar vibration travel up his legs, through the seat, and into his shoulders. It was the sensation of being connected to 8 tons of metal, fuel, and ammunition. Takeoff followed in succession. One by one, the Thunderbolts rolled down the wet runway and rose into the overcast sky. The training was organized at 10,000 feet. The bombers appeared as dark dots on the horizon, growing into massive silhouettes of aluminum and glass. The English Channel fell away. The coast of occupied France loomed below, shrouded in a haze that hid the scars of war. Brownell maintained his position at the far left of the echelon. His eyes scanned the sky constantly. He looked for dots that moved differently than the clouds. I was looking for reflections of light on metal surfaces. He was searching for enemies who didn't yet know they were being watched. War in the air was a matter of energy. Altitude was potential energy. Speed was kinetic energy. Whoever controlled the energy controlled the fight. Brownell knew this. Every pilot knew this. But knowing and applying were different things. Discipline demanded that he stay with the bombers. Tactics demanded that he stay put. Instinct, however, was beginning to suggest something different. The formation crossed German airspace at 10:30. The sun tried unsuccessfully to pierce the clouds. Below, the cities and towns looked like miniature models, connected by roads as thin as threads. Brownell adjusted the altitude trim. The thin air at 5,000 meters required constant adjustments to the fuel mixture. The Pratt & Whitney engine responded smoothly. The outside temperature was -20 degrees. The cold penetrated through the layers of leather and wool of his uniform. He flexed his fingers inside his gloves to maintain circulation. Every detail mattered. A numb finger could cost half a second of reaction time. Half a second was the difference between life and death. The radio crackled. Visual contact with enemy fighters to the northeast. Higher altitude. Descending in formation. The squadron leader's voice sounded calm, almost monotone. There was no panic in the tone, just information. Brownell turned his head to the right and saw the dark dots against the clear sky above the clouds. Messerschmitt 109. 4, maybe 5 aircraft. They were descending in a low dive, gathering speed before the attack. It was a familiar tactic. Close in quickly, fire a burst, climb again before the escort fighters could react. It depended on surprise and momentum. Brownell didn't break formation. He held his position alongside the bombers as ordered. The Messerschmitts passed along the side of the formation, firing short bursts. The sound of the machine guns was muffled by the distance and the roar of their own engines. He saw the tracers cut through the air like red lines disappearing into the void. One of the B-17s belched black smoke from engine number 3. The propeller began to spin uncontrollably before locking up. The aircraft slowly lost altitude, but remained airborne. The Messerschmitts climbed again, gaining altitude for a second pass. It was at this moment that Brownell made a decision not written in the operations manual. He knew the enemy fighters would climb to repeat the attack. He knew they relied on altitude to gain speed. And he knew that the Thunderbolt, despite its weight, had a characteristic few pilots fully exploited. It was virtually indestructible in a dive. The aircraft's structure had been designed to withstand extreme gravitational forces. It could dive deeper and faster than any German fighter without disintegrating in mid-air. He pressed forward on the stick. The Thunderbolt's nose dropped sharply. The horizon disappeared above the windshield. The altimeter began to descend rapidly. 10,000 feet, 2,500, 2,000. The speed increased aggressively. The airspeed indicator went from 480 kilometers per hour to 600, then 700. The wind whistled through the cockpit gaps. The aircraft's structure vibrated but remained solid. Brownell maintained the dive, 500 kilometers per hour. The engine roared at maximum intensity. The propeller spun so fast it seemed to emit a high-pitched, almost metallic sound. At that moment, something unexpected happened. Speed continued to increase beyond what the engine could produce alone. The Thunderbolt was no longer being pushed by the Pratt & Whitney's power. It was being pulled by gravity and aerodynamics. Propeller drag should have limited acceleration, but Brownell realized that the blade's rotation itself was contributing to thrust. The propeller was no longer simply spinning. It was functioning like a primitive turbine, sucking air in from the front and expelling it from the rear with additional force. The effect was subtle but real, 900 kilometers per hour. The Thunderbolt surpassed the terminal velocity any piston engine fighter should reach. Brownell felt the pressure against his chest increase. Gravitational force pushed him back into the seat. He clenched his leg and abdominal muscles to prevent the blood from rushing down and causing him to lose consciousness. His vision began to narrow at the edges. He took a deep breath, forcing air into his lungs against the pressure. 1,000 kilometers per hour. The Thunderbolt was now traveling at a speed no operating manual mentioned. This was uncharted territory. Below him the ground was approaching with alarming speed. He needed to level the aircraft before it was too late. He pulled back gently on the stick, applying steady pressure without sudden movements. The gravitational pull increased even more, 4 times his body weight, 5 times. The Thunderbolt began to pull out of the dive, tracing a wide curve in the sky. The wings flexed visibly under the load, but didn't break. The metal structure held. Brownell maintained pressure on the stick until the aircraft's nose was pointing toward the horizon again. The altimeter stabilized at 4,000 meters. He had lost nearly 4,000 meters of altitude in less than 40 seconds. The radio exploded with confused voices. Someone shouted a call sign. Another pilot asked if he'd seen a German fighter on fire. The squadron leader demanded a position report. Brownell didn't respond immediately. He was checking his instruments. Engine temperature high but within limits. Oil pressure stable, structure, no visible damage. He'd pushed the aircraft beyond all known parameters, and it had held. It was only when he looked up that he realized the impact of his maneuver. The Messerschmitts preparing the second attack had broken their dive. They were scattered, confused. They had seen something they didn't understand. A Thunderbolt descending at impossible speed, disappearing below them faster than any aircraft they knew. Surprise had broken the coordination of the attack. One of the German pilots turned west, abandoning the mission. The others climbed even higher, gaining defensive altitude. The moment had passed. The bombers continued their course with no new immediate threats. Brownell climbed back to escort altitude. He rejoined the formation without comment. No one asked where he had been. No one saw exactly what had happened, but he knew. He had discovered something that even Republic aviation engineers had not fully anticipated. The Thunderbolt, under the right conditions, could behave like something more than a conventional fighter. The formation returned to Bodney Base in the early afternoon. The sky over England had cleared slightly, but the wind remained piercing. Brownell landed the Thunderbolt with precision, feeling the weight of the aircraft transfer from the wings to the landing gear. The wheels touched down with a dull thud. He gradually reduced engine power, letting the aircraft roll into the parking area. The engine shut down. The silence that followed seemed deeper than it should have been. His ears still rang with the accumulated noise of 4 hours of flying. He stepped off the wing and walked to the debriefing room. The other pilots were already there, removing their flight suits, lighting cigarettes, and recounting the mission's events in the technical, detached language that war demanded. The intelligence officer wrote everything down on a pad of paper: number of enemy contacts, altitude of engagements, damage to the bombers. Brownell waited his turn. When it was time to report, he kept his description to the point. He reported the dive to a defensive position. He mentioned the speed achieved. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't dramatize. He simply reported the numbers. The intelligence officer stopped writing and looked up. He repeated the number aloud, as if needing confirmation that he had heard correctly. 1,000 kilometers per hour. Brownell nodded. The officer made a note on the side of the paper, marked with a question mark. Speeds like that weren't considered possible for piston-engine aircraft. There were reports of vertical dives reaching 700, perhaps 800 kilometers per hour in extreme situations, but 1,000 kilometers per hour was the realm of theoretical speculation. It was the kind of speed German engineers were aiming for with the new Messerschmitt 262 jets. It wasn't something a Thunderbolt was supposed to achieve. Brownell didn't insist. He knew what he'd seen on the instrument. He knew what he'd felt in the airframe. But he also knew that extraordinary reports required extraordinary evidence. There was no footage. There were no direct witnesses, just his word and the numbers recorded in his memory. He finished the debriefing and left. 2 days later, a major from the Flight Engineering Division showed up at the base. He wanted to speak with Lieutenant Brownell. He wanted details. The conversation took place in a small room adjacent to the maintenance hangar. The major introduced himself as Edgar Williams, an aeronautical engineer trained at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Before the war, he had worked on the development of variable pitch propellers for commercial aviation. He was familiar with aircraft behavior under extreme conditions. He was there because Brownell's report had caught the attention of someone in command. Supersonic speeds were an active but still theoretical field of research. The sound barrier was considered a physical limit that no manned aircraft had crossed in a controlled manner. Brownell wasn't claiming to have crossed that barrier. He was claiming to have come dangerously close. Williams asked specific questions. What was the altitude at the start of the dive? What was the angle of descent? How long did the acceleration last? How did the aircraft respond to commands? Were there any abnormal vibrations? Was there a loss of control? Brownell answered each question precisely. There was no hesitation in his answers. There was no uncertainty. He had observed everything with the attention of someone who understood that details mattered. Williams wrote everything down. After 40 minutes of technical questioning, he closed his notebook and fell silent for a few seconds. The major explained that the phenomenon described by Brownell was theoretically possible, but extremely rare. In a prolonged vertical dive, gravity accelerated the aircraft beyond the engine's capacity. The propeller, spinning at high speeds, created an air compression effect that temporarily increased propulsive efficiency. It wasn't a true jet. It wasn't continuous combustion generating thrust, but it was an aerodynamic effect that briefly mimicked the behavior of a turbine. The Thunderbolt structure, designed to withstand extreme loads, allowed the aircraft to survive these conditions. Other, lighter fighters would have disintegrated. The wings would have torn off. The fuselage would have split in half. Williams asked if Brownell intended to repeat the maneuver. The answer was blunt. Not by choice, only if necessary. The maneuver had no obvious tactical value. It didn't increase the ability to shoot down enemies. It didn't improve bomber protection. It was a demonstration of structural limits, not a combat technique. But there was something Brownell didn't mention aloud, and Williams realized without needing to ask. The maneuver had revealed something about the machine. It had shown that the aircraft were capable of more than even their designers had imagined. And that had value. Not immediate. Not practical, but it had value for the future. The Major left the base late that afternoon. He took his notes and a copy of the flight report with him. Brownell returned to normal operations. He flew 14 more missions until the end of February 1945. None of them required an extreme vertical dive. None of them produced speeds approaching what had been achieved that January day. The air war over Germany was entering its final phase. The Luftwaffe was disintegrating, fuel scarce, and pilots inexperienced. Escort missions became almost routine. The sky was less dangerous, but also less challenging. In March, Brownell received orders to return to the United States. He had completed 50 missions. His combat tour was over. He boarded a Douglas C-47 Skytrain transport that crossed the Atlantic in stages, stopping in Iceland and then Newfoundland before landing in New Jersey. The war in Europe would end in less than 2 months. He wouldn't be there to see it. He returned to Springfield, to the house where he had grown up, to the streets he had known since childhood. He returned to work at the turbine factory. Civilian life absorbed him back with the same indifference with which it had released him 2 years earlier. But the report Major Williams had brought didn't disappear. It was filed in an office at the United States Army Air Materiel Command. It was read by engineers beginning to consider the future of combat aviation. It was mentioned in informal conversations about the limits of conventional aircraft, and eventually it was included in a data set used to design the next generation of fighters. Aircraft that wouldn't rely on propellers, aircraft that would be designed from the outset to fly beyond the speed of sound. The years following the end of World War II brought a radical transformation to military aviation. What was once considered impossible became the target of systematic research. The sound barrier ceased to be a theoretical limit and became an engineering challenge to be overcome. Laboratories in the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain competed to develop aircraft capable of controlled and sustained supersonic flight. The future of aerial warfare would no longer belong to propellers. It would belong to jets. In October 1947, Captain Charles Elwood Yeager crossed the sound barrier aboard the Bell X-1, an experimental bullet-shaped aircraft powered by a rocket engine. The flight took place over California's Mojave Desert at an altitude of 13,000 meters. The speed reached was 1,002 kilometers per hour. It was a historic milestone. It proved that supersonic flight was possible, but it also confirmed something engineers had already suspected. The transition through the speed of sound required precise controls, a reinforced structure, and a deep understanding of the aerodynamic forces at play. It wasn't something just any aircraft could do, and it certainly wasn't something that should be attempted in combat by a single pilot without adequate instrumentation. But Yeager wasn't the first. He was the first to cross the barrier in a controlled manner, in a purpose-built aircraft with full telemetry and a team of engineers monitoring every second of the flight. 2 years earlier, Roger Brownell had pushed an operational fighter jet to the very edge of this barrier, without specialized instruments, without a support team, without even the certainty that the aircraft would survive. There was no glory in it. There was no public recognition. There was only a filed report, and a few engineers who knew what it meant. Republic Aviation Corporation, manufacturer of the P-47 Thunderbolt, continued operating after the war. The company shifted its focus to jet development. In 1947, it introduced the Republic F-84 Thunderjet, the first mass-produced jet fighter for the United States Air Force. It was a completely different aircraft from the Thunderbolt. Faster, more modern, and without a propeller. But there was something in the design philosophy that remained. Robust structure, damage-absorbing ability, reliability over elegance. Republic engineers hadn't forgotten the lessons of the Thunderbolt, and some of them had read Brownell's dive report. In 1953, a technical document was published by the Air Force Research and Development Division. The title was discreet: Vertical Dive Performance Analysis of World War II Fighters. The document compiled structural test data, pilot reports, and primitive computer simulations. One section specifically analyzed the P-47, It mentioned that the aircraft had been capable of reaching speeds approaching 580 miles per hour in controlled dives during factory testing. But there was a footnote, a reference to a combat report from January 1945, in which an unidentified pilot had reported speeds exceeding 1,000 miles per hour. The footnote indicated that the data had not been independently verified, but that the technical description was consistent with theoretical models. Brownell never read this document. He no longer worked in aviation. He had returned to civilian life and stayed away from military circles. He married in 1947. He had 2 children. He continued working at the turbine factory, eventually becoming a maintenance supervisor. He was respected by his colleagues as meticulous and trustworthy. Few knew of his military career. He didn't talk about the war. He didn't attend veterans' reunions. He didn't wear insignia or decorations. The war had been a task. It had been accomplished. There was no reason to revisit it. But in 1962, something changed. A young Air Force engineer named Paul Henderson was researching Thunderbolt flight histories for a project comparing fighter aircraft from different generations. He found Brownell's report in the archives. He was intrigued. He searched for more information. He discovered the pilot was still alive, living in Massachusetts. He wrote a letter, polite, technical, and unemotional. He simply asked if it would be possible to discuss the details of that January 1945 flight. Brownell didn't respond immediately. He kept the letter for 2 weeks. He considered whether it was worth it. Finally, he wrote back, a short reply. He confirmed the basic facts. He offered to speak on the phone if truly necessary. Henderson called 3 days later. The conversation lasted an hour. Brownell described the maneuver with the same precision he had used 17 years earlier. Henderson asked technical questions. Brownell responded without emotion. In the end, Henderson asked why he had done it, why he had risked the aircraft and his own life in an unauthorized maneuver. Brownell's answer was simple. It hadn't been a calculated risk. It had been a test of the limits. He wanted to see how far the machine could go, not out of curiosity, but because in aerial combat, knowing your aircraft's limits was the difference between having options and not having them. Most pilots never pushed their aircraft to their true limits. They operated within safe margins. This was sensible, but it also meant they never knew what they really had. Brownell wanted to know, and he found out. Henderson thanked him and hung up. 2 months later, he sent a copy of an article he had written for a military aviation technical journal. The article discussed the evolution of fighter design between 1945 and 1960. It mentioned the Thunderbolt episode as an example of how pilots, in extreme situations, often discovered capabilities that even the designers themselves were unaware of. Brownell read the article once. He put it away in a drawer. He never mentioned it again. The following decades witnessed the full maturation of supersonic aviation. What had been an experimental feat in 1947 became operational routine. Fighters such as the North American F-100 Super Sabre, the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom, and the Lockheed F-100 Starfighter regularly operated above the speed of sound. The Vietnam War demonstrated that modern aerial combat required not only speed, but also maneuverability, sophisticated electronics, and guided missiles. The era of machine guns and visual dogfights was ending. The era of radar and beyond the visual horizon engagements was beginning. Brownell followed these changes from afar through technical magazines and news reports. He retired from the factory in 1979. He was 58 years old. His health was good. He began devoting more time to hobbies he had neglected during his decades of work. He built scale model aircraft. These weren't decorative models. They were technically accurate replicas, with working control systems and electric motors. He tested each model in an open field outside Springfield, adjusting the weight, the center of gravity, the angle of the control surfaces. It was the same mentality he had brought to the war. Understand how things worked, push them to the limit, see what happened. In 1985, a documentary about the history of the P-47 Thunderbolt was produced by an educational television station. The production team sought out veterans who had flown the aircraft during the war. Brownell was contacted through an Air Force Veterans Association. Initially, he refused to participate. He didn't like cameras. He didn't like the attention. But the producer insisted. He explained that the documentary wasn't about heroism. It was about engineering. It was about how a robust and underrated machine had become one of the most effective aircraft of the war. Brownell agreed on the condition that the interview would be technical, no dramatization. The recording took place in his home, in the living room. He wore a simple shirt without insignia. He answered questions with his usual clarity. He talked about the aircraft's structure, the radial engine and its damage-absorbing capabilities. He talked about the operating altitude, the range and the weapons load. And then the interviewer mentioned the dive in January 1945. He asked if Brownell could describe what had happened. There was a pause. Brownell stared into the camera for a few seconds. Then he began to speak. He described the mission. He described the decision to dive. He described the speed. He described the feeling of being at the absolute limit of the machine. And he described the conclusion he had reached that day. The Thunderbolt was not just a robust fighter. It was an aircraft that, under the right conditions, could touch the future. It could behave like something that didn't yet exist. It wasn't a jet, but for a few seconds it had imitated one. The interviewer asked if he considered it an achievement. Brownell shook his head. It wasn't an achievement. It was an observation. The aircraft had done the job. He had simply been there to witness it. The documentary aired 6 months later. Brownell's interview took up less than 3 minutes of the hour-long program. But those 3 minutes drew attention. Letters poured in from aviation enthusiasts, retired engineers and historians. Everyone wanted to know more. Some questioned the veracity of the account. Others offered alternative technical explanations. Brownell didn't respond to any of the letters. There was nothing more to say. In 1993, the United States Air Force hosted a ceremony honoring the pilots who had flown the P-47 during World War II. The event took place at Wright-Patterson AFB in Ohio. Brownell was invited. This time he accepted without hesitation, not because of the ceremony, but because there would be a restored Thunderbolt on display. He wanted to see the aircraft again. He wanted to touch the metal. He wanted to remember the weight of the controls. The aircraft was parked in a hangar, polished to a gleam under the lights. It was a P-47D, the same model he had flown. Brownell walked around it slowly. He ran his hand over the wing, the fuselage, the propeller. A retired general who had also flown Thunderbolts during the war approached. The two chatted briefly. The general mentioned that he had read about Brownell's dive. He asked if he was sure of the numbers. Brownell confirmed it. 1,000 kilometers per hour. The general nodded. He said he had never attempted anything like it. He said Brownell had either been very brave or very reckless. Brownell smiled for the first time in the entire conversation. He said it had probably been both. The ceremony was brief. Speeches were made. Tributes were paid. Medals were presented. Brownell received a commemorative plaque. He offered a few words of thanks. At the end of the event, while the other veterans chatted and reminisced, he returned to the hangar. He stood alone before the Thunderbolt for a few more minutes. He wasn't thinking about the war. He wasn't thinking about the past. He was thinking about how the aircraft had been designed to do one thing, but had been able to do another. He was thinking about how limits weren't fixed. They were just points no one had crossed yet. He left the base late that afternoon. He returned to Massachusetts. He returned to the quiet routine of his life. The Thunderbolt remained in the hangar, a museum object, a relic of a war that had ended nearly 50 years earlier. But what Brownell had discovered that January day in 1945 was no relic. It was a principle. Machines were capable of more than they appeared, and the men who operated them had to be willing to explore those limits. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because that was how progress happened. Pushing, testing, discovering. Roger Clinton Brownell died in April 2007 at the age of 86. His death was peaceful at home, surrounded by his family. There was no military ceremony. There was no procession with honors. He had left clear instructions. A simple funeral, no long speeches, no dramatization. It was consistent with the way he had lived, discreet, methodical, averse to the spotlight. The obituary published in the local newspaper mentioned his career in the turbine factory, his 60-year marriage, his children and grandchildren. It briefly mentioned that he had served as a pilot during World War II. It didn't mention diving. It didn't mention speed. It didn't mention that he had for a few decisive seconds touched the limit between the possible and the impossible. But the story didn't end with his death. In 2011, a Smithsonian Institution researcher was cataloging documents donated by World War II veterans. Among the papers, he found a copy of the original report Brownell had submitted in January 1945. The document was yellowed, the typed letters nearly erased in places, but the numbers were still legible: initial altitude, dive angle, maximum recorded speed. The researcher digitized the document and included it in the museum's digital archive. It is now accessible to anyone interested in military aviation history. Historians began to revisit the episode. Articles were published in specialized journals. Technical analyses were performed using modern aerodynamic simulation software. Conclusions varied. Some engineers argued that it was impossible for a Thunderbolt to reach 1,000 kilometers per hour without disintegrating. Others pointed out that the conditions described by Brownell, high altitude, prolonged vertical dive, reinforced structure, could theoretically allow such speed for a very brief period. There was no consensus, but there was respect. Even those who questioned the numbers didn't question the intent. Brownell hadn't lied. He had reported what he saw, and he had lived the rest of his life without seeking external validation. The technical debate continued, but something deeper emerged from these discussions. Brownell's story became an example of how technological progress often depended on individuals willing to test limits without formal authorization. The engineers who designed the Thunderbolt had not anticipated the aircraft could reach such speeds. There were no manuals for it. There was no training. Brownell had discovered a hidden capability of the machine because he was willing to push it beyond the known. It wasn't blind recklessness. It was technical curiosity combined with skill. It was the mindset of someone who understood that design specifications were only the beginning, not the end. This mindset echoed through subsequent generations of test pilots. Men and women who flew experimental aircraft in the decades that followed often cited examples from World War II as inspiration. Chuck Yeager, who crossed the sound barrier in a controlled manner in 1947, was well aware that others had come close before him. The difference lay in the instrumentation, the preparation, the stated objective. But the courage to push beyond what was safe was already present in pilots like Brownell. They didn't receive medals for it. They didn't have their names engraved on monuments, but they paved the way. The P-47 Thunderbolt ended its operational career shortly after the end of World War II. It was replaced by more modern, faster jets, better suited to the new era of military aviation. However, some units remained in service in secondary roles until the early 1950s. Many were sold to other countries' air forces. Some ended up as training targets on firing ranges. Others were dismantled and recycled. Only a few dozen have survived to this day, preserved in museums or kept in flying condition by collectors and historical aviation associations. One of these aircraft, restored with absolute technical precision, flies regularly at aviation events in the United States. It's a P-47D, painted with the colors and insignia of the 352nd Fighter Group. The pilot operating it knows Brownell's story. He's familiar with the dive of January 1945. He's never attempted to replicate the maneuver. There's no reason to. The aircraft is too valuable a piece of history to risk. But he understands what that moment represented. He understands that Brownell wasn't seeking to break records. He was seeking to understand the machine. And through this understanding, he contributed, even without knowing it, to the evolution of combat aviation. Roger Brownell's story is a story about limits, not about breaking them spectacularly, but about discovering them methodically. It's a story about the relationship between man and machine, about trust in metal structures, and about the quiet courage to do something no one has done before. There are no flags waving. There are no cheering crowds. There's just one man alone in a cockpit, 16,000 feet above the ground, pushing the stick forward and watching the numbers climb on the airspeed indicator. There's only the decision to trust the engineering, to trust the training, to trust himself. The sky over Germany that January day was grey and indifferent. The war continued. The bombers completed their mission. The fighters returned to base. Everything continued as usual. But something had changed. A threshold had been reached. And though few knew it at the time, that moment became part of the long chain of discoveries that would eventually take humanity beyond the speed of sound, beyond the atmosphere, beyond what any pilot in 1945 could imagine. Brownell didn't know this. He didn't need to know. He had done his part. The rest was in time. If you've made it this far, thank you for taking the time to read this story. If it sparked your curiosity about wartime engineering, the men who operated these machines, or the forgotten moments that shaped modern aviation, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told. Stories of split-second decisions. Stories of engineering pushed to the limit. Stories that deserve to be remembered. Leave a like if this story made you reflect. And comment below. Do you believe Brownell really reached 1,000 miles per hour that day? Until the next story.